Today's presentation is Somaticism, Pain, and Malingering among North Carolina Civil War Veterans, analysis of 2 early pension programs, and our presenter is Daniel S. Goldberg, JD, PhD, an assistant professor in bioethics and interdisciplinary studies. And here is Daniel Goldberg to speak on Somaticism, Pain, and Malingering among North Carolina Civil War Veterans, analysis of 2 early pension programs.
Thanks, Melissa. Thanks, everybody, for spending part of your Monday afternoon with me. So this project I have been working on for about 2.5 years, pretty much since the day I set foot here at East Carolina University. The manuscript on which this is based, I actually just sent off about a week ago, so I'm pretty excited about that, okay? So a couple things, just basically let you guys know where we're going before I get started. I'm gonna say this once and then I'm just gonna repeat it. I am not a Civil War historian, okay? And then I'm just gonna say this again. I am not a Civil War historian, okay? Because a lot of times I've given various presentations based on my preliminary results and things like this. And you know, people, especially in the sesquicentennial and in the South here, people get very excited about the Civil War. They get very excited about Civil War medicine, and I don't know much about either of those 2 things, okay, to be honest with you. So I know a little bit about the Civil War because it's obviously part of the story of what happened to the veterans whose stories I am interested in, right? But I'm definitely not an expert on the Civil War, and I would not be surprised if several of you out in the audience know quite a bit more about it than I do, okay? I am, in fact, an intellectual historian. And what that means is I study the history of ideas. I'm particularly interested in the way that ideas shape material history. What does that mean? The way I think about it is, you know, people think, well, we have these ideas and they're out there and yeah, we have nice ideas, but what do they really accomplish? And what I'm particularly interested in is the way in which ideas actually do affect things that happen. They do shape events and conditions, what people call material history. How does that happen? Well, this is a case study. This is an example of how ideas actually shape material history. So this is what I'm particularly interested in. So let's take a look, just to sort of start, with the pension claim of a man named Marion W. Allison. Okay, so on February 17th, in 1887, in or around Cedar Grove, North Carolina, a man named Marion W. Allison appeared before another man named Pride Jones, who was the clerk of the Superior Court at Orange County. Okay, how do we know this? What was he doing there? He was applying for a pension. And we know this because he filed a pension claim that has this information, okay? The pension claim he filed was filed pursuant to the Pension Act, the North Carolina Pension Act of 1885. We'll talk quite a bit about the Pension Act of 1885. That's the sort of primary study that I'm working on here. This is important. North Carolina is a particularly good state for studying pension systems, early pension systems in the former Confederacy, because it was quite progressive. The Pension Act of 1885 was really the first of its kind in the former Confederacy, and there was another Pension Act that came 20 years earlier we'll talk about as well. That was the Artificial Limbs Program. Okay, that was also the first of its kind. So North Carolina was progressive as to pensions, right? And so it's important to think about why and what was going on with that. There were 2 huge problems with Marion W. Allison's claim. He was seeking a pension. Okay, he was a disabled Civil War veteran, Confederate veteran from North Carolina, so he said. Okay, 2 huge problems. And there's that. You probably can't read all the little squiggly lines, and that's really okay. You don't need to read all the squiggly lines, okay? There's 2 huge problems. The first problem is that he does not have physician testimony. Okay, so this is what's interesting and important. Now we're starting to see something. Physicians are a part of the pension process under the Act of 1885. In order to claim a pension, a physician had to certify that the disability existed and that the disability actually prevented the disabled veteran from working. Right? It was about labor productivity. Why that was so is an important part of the story. We'll talk a little bit about it today, although not that much. But you had to have a physician certified. There was a space for it on the form. I'll point out it's right there at the bottom. You can see there's a big blank there at the bottom of this form. You don't need to be able to see the writing. You can see there's a big blank. That's where the physician testimony is supposed to go. Okay? And this is what lawyers refer to as black letter law. There's no room for negotiation here. Okay? This is not a bunch of lawyers who are going to stand up and argue about this. If you do not have physician certification under the Pension Act of 1885, you are not eligible to get a pension claim, period. Right? I mean, that's as basic as it gets. He does not have physician testimony. That's a big problem. That is a big problem, okay? Second problem is that he's actually from Kentucky. Okay? This is also a big problem, okay? Now, you probably can't see, I'm not going to step outside the line, but that big block of writing up there near the top, that's where he actually says, you can see he almost covered in some of the typescript right? He actually pasted something over it because what's being pasted over there actually says which company, which division, which regiment of the North Carolina Army did you belong to, and he had to paste over that because he didn't belong to any of them because he actually enlisted in Kentucky. Okay, this is a big problem. So why is this a big problem? Well, because the North Carolina Pension Act was created, okay, for the benefit of North Carolina residents. I mean, North Carolina citizens. That was the whole point. It's not the case that North Carolina, like most southern states, didn't feel any affinity for their Confederates, literal Confederates in this case. They did, but you have to understand the position of North Carolina in 1885, right? I mean, you can imagine in 1860, right before the first shots were fired, even by Southern standards, North Carolina was very rural, very agrarian, very poor, very underdeveloped, and very undereducated. In fact, it had the highest illiteracy rate in the former Confederacy, along with Virginia. About 40% of the adult population couldn't read or write. Now, that includes slaves, but all of the figures that we have for that time included slaves. So North Carolina was not particularly in a good way, let's say, in 1860. Okay? And then you have to imagine the total devastation of the war. Okay? North Carolina was a major battleground state. There were a lot of battles in North Carolina, okay? And then you have to imagine what happened after that, right? You have bloody shirt politics, for those of you who know about this, right? Radical Reconstruction, which was not an easy time for people and places in states in the former Confederacy. You have severe economic depression of the 1870s, okay? You've got a lot of problems, and states really could not afford to be giving pensions to members of other states, in addition to which, I don't know if you guys remember this, but all of these states were already paying for pensions. All the states in the former Confederacy were being taxed, sometimes quite heavily because the pensions were growing, right, for the benefit of whom? Not Confederate soldiers, it was Union soldiers, right? All the states in the former Confederacy had to actually contribute to the large and growing pension scheme that was being paid out to Union veterans. Confederate veterans were, with rare exceptions, barred from recovery under this program, okay? So they really did, North Carolina was not able to really pay for veterans from Kentucky, okay? So we're not going to talk much more about the fact that he was from Kentucky, although it's interesting and important. I'm particularly interested in the fact that he didn't have physician testimony, and there it is. Okay, you can see that signature, the clerk of the Superior Court, that says Pride Jones up there at the top. Okay, and that's William J. Walker. You had to be accompanied by a witness. That was the man who came with Marion W. Allison. And you can see down there, carefully and thoroughly examined the applicant for a pension, finds him incapacitated for manual labor, is what it says, by reason of wounds received while in discharge of his duty as a soldier or sailor of North Carolina in the service of the late Confederate States. And then you have to actually describe the wounds. That's important. We'll talk about that in a minute. He doesn't have it. So Marion W. Allison is not going to get a pension claim. Right? Except he is. And he does. Not only does he get a pension claim, because actually 94% of the claims that I looked at, 94% of them actually got approved. North Carolina wasn't in the business of denying these claims, and there are a variety of reasons why they did it. First of all, most people didn't actually apply for them. Historians are in uniform agreement that the number of Confederate veterans who actually applied for pensions is a tiny fraction of the number who were probably eligible to apply for pensions, and there are a lot of reasons for that, some of which we'll actually talk about, okay? So that's number one. Most people just didn't apply. They created this for the benefit of these soldiers, right? I mean, they weren't in the business, they weren't interested in denying a bunch of them, basically, at that point, okay? So, and they didn't have to because not many people applied. So what's interesting is not whether or not his claim was ultimately approved, but whether it was held. That's what's interesting. Which claims get held? Held pending further information. I see that you filed a claim. That's not good enough. We need more information about X, Y, and Z, and we'll talk quite a bit about what that is. But his claim wasn't even, it didn't even have a hold. There was not even a hold, wait, let's get some more physician testimony because, oh, by the way, it's black letter law and you're not supposed to get a pension without it. That's not even there. His claim is approved without a hold. Why not? Why was it approved? And here's what, there's an explanation, okay? These forms are filled out on the first page, there it is, and then they're usually folded over almost like a triptych, okay? And then the disposition's on the back. And here's what it says. The evidence of the lost eye was so palpable, right? That was his injury, lost eye, that we did not deem it necessary to have a surgeon's certificate. It was palpable, right? Pride Jones, the clerk of the Superior Court, could see directly on the body of Marion W. Allison what was going on with him. He doesn't need physician certification. Anybody can see what's going on with him. He has a lost eye. It's palpable. Not just visible, by the way, guys, but palpable, okay? So that's going to be very important. Keep that in mind. We're going to explain that as we go forward, okay? So early pension programs in North Carolina, just to set the stage a little bit, right? That pension claim of Marion W. Allison is sort of a microcosm of what really we're going to be discussing and sort of what my argument is here. So the first is the Artificial Limbs Program in 1866. This was also the first pension program of any kind in the former Confederacy. Okay, it was right after the Civil War. And again, you have to try to understand in 1866 what the kind of state that North Carolina was in 1866. It was just absolutely shocking, right? Now, why was this such a priority given the larger context? The larger context is, look at the state that North Carolina's in. For goodness sake, okay? I mean, they are in a really, really bad way in 1866. And if you go through and read Governor Worth's papers, which I've read, Governor Worth was the governor at that time, you know, his major task was not just restoring North Carolina and bringing it into some kind of integrity, but also restoring it to the Union. He was very interested in kind of getting this reintegration with the greater Union, and that was clearly his top priority, okay? So we'll talk a little bit more about the artificial limbs program in a minute, but the second question is then what happens, why do we have a 2 decades gap between the artificial limbs program of 1866 and the Pension Act of 1885? What happens in between? Why does it take so long to get there, okay? We can compare this to the existence of the federal pension program. The Union pension program was actually created in 1862. It was very early, and it was created in part as an incentive to get soldiers to sign up for the war. Okay, now the Confederate Army, they did create a pension program that was created later in 1863. By the end of 1863, you can imagine what was starting to happen to the Confederate Army. Okay, they were really not in a good position to be able to having an organized and a systematic pension program, especially when their records were haphazard. They didn't have the resources that the Union Army had anyway, so they probably weren't going to be able to do nearly as good a job as the Union Army could, despite their best intentions. Okay, so there was an official Confederate pension program in 1863, but it never got off the ground. Nobody really ever got any pensions. Okay, they just sort of created it in form only. But the federal program was different. They had been paying pensions since 1862, right? And they got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, which was actually an important issue, as we'll talk about. So this is a picture of Sam Eller from the 23rd North Carolina Infantry. You can see that he has an artificial limb. We can't tell whether that's a prosthetic or what they would refer to as a peg leg. They actually called them peg legs as well, and we don't really know the date of the picture either, okay? So what's interesting about the artificial limbs program? Well, it's relatively significant benefits at a time of great stress. So how significant were the benefits, right? They were about $81,000 according to the state auditor's calculation in 1866. So we translate that to today's dollars, that's a little bit over $1 million. Now that doesn't sound like a particularly big appropriation until you understand what North Carolina was like in 1866, right? Because we've talked about what they were like in 1860, so you can only imagine what they were like after 5 years of civil war, basically, okay? You know, in fact, other states, there's some great evidence that Mississippi tried to appropriate $50,000 for an artificial limbs program, and that $50,000 appropriation was 1/5 of its total revenue in 1867. Okay, so they don't have a lot of money, right? Texas, the state of Texas, where I spent 10 years and consider myself of late, right? Texas actually, their floor debates have been recorded for posterity, unlike North Carolina. So we can actually read the legislators arguing with each other in 1867 and 1868, which is quite amusing, right? And in fact, they tried to create an artificial limbs program, but they said on the floor of the House of Representatives that they could not do it because of the state that Texas was in. And they actually said this directly, right? And in fact, then they started to create a collection among the legislators, which I think is hilarious, asking all the House of Representative members to pony up $50 so that they could start an artificial limbs program, okay? So again, relatively significant benefits at a time of great stress with all of the other things going on. Why an artificial limbs program, right? And I think one of the answers is, oftentimes when I've asked people this question, or I've asked other historians or archivists, they say, well, because there were a lot of people who needed limbs, right? I mean, there were a lot of people who I don't think that's a good answer, right? And why don't I think that's a good answer? Well, because there were a lot of dead people too, and they didn't get pensions. Widows of dead people didn't get pensions until 1885. That's 20 years later, okay? There were also a lot of injured and disabled veterans who had not lost limbs, and they didn't get pensions until 1885 either. Okay, so surely there were a lot of injured people. There were a lot of people who had lost limbs, but why artificial limbs? Why no other kind of disability? Why wasn't death or non-amputated, you know, a non-amputee, why weren't they given benefits until 20 years later? I think this has something to do with the social and the cultural significance of the loss of the limb. Okay, and we'll talk more about how you might ascribe that social and cultural significance. But it has something to do with the fact that when you see somebody with an amputation, it's visible, it's palpable. Okay, now why? How? Right? These things accelerated post-1866 to 1885. Okay, so fast forward. That's something a historian should never do, is just jump 20 years. We're going to do it anyway, okay, because time is of the essence here, right? So Pension Act of 1885. How do you explain for this 2-decade gap? One of the obvious explanations is the lost cause movement. For those of you guys who don't know what the lost cause movement is, it's sort of an ethos, a mythos. And when I say mythos, I don't mean it's fake. That's a sort of bastardization of the term myth, right? It's a movement that really starts to coalesce after the Civil War, but doesn't really get going until the late 1870s, 1880s. It's not a coincidence that you find pension programs in the former Confederacy really in the late 1880s, okay? A lot of this is a response to the lost cause movement. So what does the lost cause movement say? It's an honoring of the cause itself, right? The cause has never been corrupted among those who believe in the lost cause movement. It's not the law. It's not the cause that was corrupt, right? It's just it was a failure to bring through, and it's a tale of redemption as well, right? It's through the suffering of the South we will redeem the noble cause. What the noble cause is a matter of debate, okay? For some people it was slavery, for some people it was secession, for some people it was both, for most people it was probably a little bit of both, okay? So that's what the lost cause movement was. It was obviously evangelical, obviously very religious and spiritual, really was clothed in a lot of the reform movements as well, in the religious reform movements in the South, okay? Although by 1885 those were really starting to peter out. So this is the lost cause movement. Within the lost cause movement, we know that amputee veterans in the South were seen as what some historians have referred to as living monuments of the lost cause movement, right? How do we honor the sacrifice of those who paid the ultimate price in battle? There's the relic. There's the living monument. The living relic is actually how they were referred to of the lost cause. And there's no doubt that this started to generate momentum for these pension programs, such as the 1885 Pension Act. It's emblematic of the lost cause movement. Another factor in both the lost cause and these pension acts was shame. It was shame, right? Because the South was deeply ashamed that they were paying for federal pensions, for the pensions of Union soldiers, but their own boys, and how they refer to them, okay, were reduced to penury in some cases, right? Begging on the streets in some places, because pensions were not being provided for them. This was a source of tremendous shame for people in the South. And especially women and feminist associations saw this as a way of redeeming themselves, of redeeming the South, of redeeming the cause, right? If not the loss itself. Okay, so what do we have? What's new in the Pension Act of 1885? For the first time, widows are eligible, right? And again, I think this is in part a response to the movement of feminist associations in bringing about the Pension Act of 1885 and some of these others, right? There's some other complicated things about why widows were eligible for the first time. But widows were eligible for deceased men who had not just died in battle, but who had died of disease. Now that's important, right? Because we know that for every one soldier who died in battle of a battle wound, 2 soldiers died of disease. It's a 2-to-1 ratio, okay? So even a soldier who died of disease, the widow could actually collect now. There it is, death from disease eligible for the first time. There were some bars to recovery, okay? Remarriage, if a widow had remarried, absolute bar to recovery. If a disabled veteran's net worth was more than $500, absolute bar to recovery. If the disabled veteran had an annual salary of more than $300, it was an absolute bar to recovery. Okay, so there were some hurdles you had to meet to actually get through to get to sort of pension eligible status. So that's the background and the context. Now we're going to switch and talk about things that have nothing to do with pensions, okay? And you're going to be a little confused, and then I promise I'm going to bring you back to pensions, okay? But that's what I do because I'm an intellectual historian. So we have to talk not just about what's going on the ground, not just about social and cultural histories, but we have to talk about ideas. So what are the ideas that explain what's going on with Marion W. Allison's pension claim, okay? And here are the 2 things that I focus on: the rise of Somaticism, I know that's a hard word to pronounce, okay? And the rise of mechanical objectivity. What is Somaticism? Somaticism is generally something that historians of medicine and science, particularly historians of medicine, has focused on. It refers to changes, sea changes in the practice of medicine and most of the allied health professions, okay, during the 19th century. And I tell students this all the time. They're usually shocked, and actually I tell clinicians this as well, is, you know, the way that the way they practice medicine, the way they are learning to practice medicine or nursing or allied health or dentistry is in large part because of things that happened during the 19th century. Right? So there's things that happened before then that affected too, right? History is a seamless web. You can't just sort of pick things out. But the 19th century had some profound changes. And these profound changes, I think, can be fairly grouped under the term somaticism. Other historians would use different terms. Okay, so what do we have with somaticism? We have a focus on 2 things. One is we have a focus on discrete material pathologies. Okay? And you can see this really starts to, if you'll pardon the expression, blow up during the 19th century. Okay? So you have anatomy. Anatomy is an ancient art. Anatomy wasn't just invented in the 19th century, but during the 19th century, it became constitutive of medical practice, literally. Okay? I mean, Great Britain passed the Anatomy Act, which said that you could not be an allopathic doctor unless you had sufficient training in anatomy. Okay? And that was mirrored in the United States, right? So anatomy becomes the definition of what it means to be an allopathic physician. So here you see the pathologic change on the spinal cord, the growth in post-mortem examinations, all these things happen in the 19th century. But it's not just pathological anatomy. That's only one part of it. I call this the twin suns. They kind of revolve around each other. You don't just have to have pathological anatomy. You have to have clinical correlation. It's not just enough to look inside a dead body and find a dysmorphology, right? A discrete pathology. You have to be able to clinically correlate that pathology with an illness complaint. Who's got the illness complaint? The patient. When did they have it? When they were still alive, because if we're looking inside their body, at this point they're dead, okay, right? I mean, we're doing postmortems, hopefully, right, okay, although vivisection was quite popular on dogs and other animals during this time as well, okay? And you can see why a lot of people were very afraid of vivisection of humans as well. So these are changes in 19th century medicine. If you're interested in this, you can Google the term Paris School, really because these changes are most notable and most famous in and around Paris, and this starts literally right at the year 1800. Why Paris? That's complicated, don't have time, you can ask me and I'll tell you. Okay, or you can Google it, right? This is so powerful. Robert Martinson, who is a physician and a historian, he's actually the director of the Office of History at the NIH, he has actually said that in its reliance on anatomical learning, it's Western medicine's most distinctive knowledge-making characteristic, right? We still call it the anatomo-clinical method. Some people will call it the clinico-pathologic method, but it's really the same thing, right? This happens here. This happens in the 19th century, middle decades, exactly the same time period we're talking about with regard to North Carolina. That's somaticism. Okay? And there's no doubt that this is transatlantic. This is Paris, this is Edinburgh, this is Berlin, this is Vienna, but it's New York, it's Boston, it's Philadelphia, and by the 1870s and 1880s, it's Richmond, it's Charleston, it's North Carolina. There's no doubt about that, okay? And I talk about this in the manuscript as well. So what's mechanical objectivity? Mechanical objectivity appears in the middle decades of the 19th century. Now, when I say objectivity appears, that is a very peculiar thing, okay? Because we use the terms objective and subjective constantly, especially, okay, on a health sciences campus. People use the terms objective and subjective constantly. But one of the things that's important to understand about objectivity is that the concept has a history. It didn't just come down to us, handed down in its present form. Right? Historians of science have studied this, and they have traced, since the early modern era, so since about the year 1600, no less than 4 or 5 different concepts of objectivity. Some of them, nobody in this room would recognize as sounding anything like the term objective, trust me, okay? So we're not going to have time to talk about the different kinds. We'll talk about one, mechanical objectivity. This appears in the middle decades of the 19th century. This chronology is not coincidental with what we're talking about. So what are the two things that characterize mechanical objectivity? The first is the elimination of subjective influence, right? And when you talk about this, you have to think about the scientist, the natural investigator, the physician, who's doing the research, okay? Who's looking at the natural world. And the idea is nature has the truth. Truth is with a capital T. Okay, this is where this starts to happen in the 19th century, and all we have to do is know how to look. We have to have the trained investigators. And the trained investigator is going to look, but if the trained investigator gets in the way, then nature can't speak for itself. Right? Nature can't tell us its secrets, can't reveal its truth. We have to eliminate as much subjective influence as possible from the course of the natural investigation itself. Now, this sounds totally obvious to you guys, okay? Because what would objectivity mean otherwise to most of us thinking about today, which actually shows that the concept of mechanical objectivity still has very powerful appeal today, and it does. There's very little doubt about that, okay? So, elimination of subjective influence. It sounds ridiculous, but take my word for it that this was a pretty new thing in the middle decades of the 19th century. A couple hundred years earlier, that would have been ludicrous. The early modern natural philosophers, they were scientists, but they would have called themselves natural philosophers, they would have thought that that was preposterous. In fact, they would have said that the truth value of an image that they were representing was a function of their expertise. They wanted to get as closely involved as they possibly could in the production of the image. Not coincidentally, the people who have studied objectivity as historians of science have focused on images. Well, that's important because we're talking about seeing. We're talking about, remember, the palpable eye in Marion W. Allison's claim, okay? So seeing becomes important. And here's where it is as well. There's an epistemological component to objectivity. What that means is that natural objects are invested as sites of truth. It's the objects in nature themselves that will tell us the truth of the matter. The truth of what matter? Well, any matter. It doesn't matter, whatever it is we're interested in, right? If we want to study disease, we open up the patient's body, we look inside, we find the lesions. The lesions are the natural objects that will reveal the truth of the illness complaint, okay? So you can do lesions if you want. A lot of people were interested in botanicals, right? You get lots of botanical prints in the early modern era. This is still very, very popular in the 19th century, in the middle decades of the 19th century. So again, it's the natural object itself that reveals the truth of the matter. What is the truth of the plant? How is it supposed to look? What's its proper genus and species? How many leaves does it have, right? Is it asexual or not? How does it germinate? How does it pollinate? Okay, so if the investigator gets out of the way and represents it as faithfully as possible, the natural object itself contains the truth of the matter. We want to represent this, okay, in imaging. And this is where it's no coincidence that in the middle and later decades of the 19th century, we have an explosion in scientific imaging. A veritable explosion up until the modern era, up until 1800. It was mostly woodcuts and illustrations, okay, paintings and art of various different kinds. In the 19th century, everything changes. We have photographs for the first time. Photographs are just enormously influential. They change everything, okay? We have lithographs. We have microscopy. Microscopy wasn't invented in the 19th century, but it only became famous and only became popular. A lot of scientists and physicians only realized what they had with microscopy in the 19th century. So definitely a new form of seeing. And then later on, by 1895, 1896, we get X-rays, okay? And I've actually worked on X-rays as well. X-rays became very important because for the first time, you could actually open up the living body and see inside. No more vivisection, right? No more dead people anymore. You could actually X-ray and see inside a living body. So I know this is abstruse because we're not talking about pensions, but we're coming, okay? Other important point to understand before we get back to pensions. The Victorian era, this is 1885, okay? This is probably, I don't know, I would call it the late Victorian era, although it's still smack dab in the middle of the Victorian era at this point. There were a lot of social anxieties. The Victorian era was a very, very anxious time. I did a Google search for Victorian anxiety and just bam, there it was. Right? Munch's painting of 1894, which is absolutely perfect in terms of timing, right? Within a decade of the period we're talking about. It's called anxiety, for goodness sake, right? I mean, so there you go. It's not that other times aren't anxious, but you have to understand, between 1800 and 1900, I mean, the Western world completely changes, right? So industrialization, urbanization completely changes to family structure, labor productivity, migrations from one place to another like the world hasn't seen in centuries, okay? So the world turns literally upside down between 1800 and 1900. And this was strongly felt in Victorian anxieties. It's a very anxious time. Victorians were obsessed with issues of truth and doubt, with issues of authenticity and deception. When did Arthur Conan Doyle write his stories? This is when he wrote his stories, okay? When did the detective genre become popular? This is when the detective genre became popular. This is true with all sorts of different things. There's an increasing concern among Victorians all over the Western world that things are not what they seem, right? That artifice is afoot, that people are not presenting what and who they truly are. And this was a big issue with photographs. People were very concerned about the possibility that photographs didn't represent what they seemed, okay? There's a forensic gestalt. Right, this plays in medicine and science, right? Again, the idea of detection, of ferreting out the truth becomes very, very important in a late Victorian context. And this absolutely plays in with doctors and scientists. They get sort of shepherded into this whole idea. They are the detectives. They are the investigators. And think about how this coheres with ideas of somaticism and objectivity. It works perfectly. It's exactly what you would expect if these ideas are sort of part of the same milieu, right? We want to ferret out the truth of what happened to this patient. So we open them up and look for the lesions, right? We look for the material pathology that we can clinically correlate with their illness complaints. And mechanical objectivity is the same. We want to know the truth of the matter. We want to know, right, what do the natural objects tell us? We have to have the right sort of tools to be able to do that. So again, industrialization, urbanization, all these things play in very, very well with what's going on. So I promise, now we come back to pensions, okay? How do we bring all this back to pensions? So this is the core of the study. There are about 4,200 claims that are extant that were filed by North Carolina Civil War veterans and widows. I took a sample of about a little bit less than 1,200. The sample actually wasn't randomized initially, so we had the kind assistance of Paul Voss in the Department of Biostatistics in helping me be sure that the sample I did choose was representative. And then I coded it over a period of a few years. And this just gives you an example of some of the codes, okay? Oops. Hey, go back. Go back. Oh. Seem to have frozen. There we go. Okay. Sorry, guys. Okay. These are an example of some of the codes. The date, the identity, who was the person who came, right? I mean, if it was the disabled veteran, they actually had to appear themselves. If it was a dead veteran, They weren't going to appear themselves, okay? It was a widow or a family member, okay? What's the nature of the disability? What's the disposition? What ultimately happened with it? As I said, that's not very interesting, okay? The hold status, that is very interesting. Why were they held? So here are some of the possible reasons that a claim could be held. 1, amputation or shortening of the limb. You can guess I'm probably pretty interested in that one, okay? Number 2, death, missing, presumed dead, loss of sight, hearing, limited range of motion, pain and suffering. That's an interesting one. Gunshot wounds. Okay, and then those are the kinds of disabilities on the right are the reasons for the holds. Why would a claim be held? Well, circumstance of the injury. How did you actually get injured? Right? The lost cause movement says you had to sacrifice yourself on the field of battle. There's lots of ways you could get injured in a war. You don't have to be on the field of battle. Could you recover for those? And the answer is actually no, you couldn't. That gets interesting and important, okay? Cause of death, time and place of death, identity. We'll talk about what that is in a minute. Number 5, that's the big one, incapacity to work. That's a big one. We'll talk about that. That's probably the most important one for my purposes. Right, it would be held. They would say, well, yes, you filed a pension, but we really need further proof that you are actually incapable of working before we're going to grant you a pension. Are you a North Carolina resident? Marion W. Allison should have had a problem with that one, okay, but he didn't. Lack of physician testimony. Should have had a problem with that one again, but he didn't. Okay? Proof of death, time of death, and insufficient witness testimony. A witness didn't come with you. Okay? So how did I analyze the data? What did I do? So I did mostly qualitative analysis, right? So going through the claims and picking things out. But again, there was a sort of a very, very rudimentary quantitative analysis as well. So here's what gets interesting. 4 claimants who did not have what I call a visible injury. So what's a visible injury? Well, it's, again, what we saw with Marion W. Allison. It's someone that the clerk or whoever was there could literally see on the person's body. So what kinds of visible injuries would you see? Well, loss of an eye, that's an obvious one. Okay? Loss of a limb, that's a pretty obvious one. Shortening of a limb, maybe, depending on how obvious it is. Suppurating wounds. Unfortunately, that's not an uncommon sequelae from mini A-ball wounds. That was the actual shot that they used in the Civil War. Okay, so suppurating wounds, necrotizing bone, there'd be bone coming out and stuff like that. Those are visible wounds. Okay, so those who do not have a visible injury, who don't have one of those kinds of injuries, there's the odds ratio is 1.7 times. Okay, they are 1.7 times odds, greater odds of being held. That's a 34% higher risk of having your claim held if you do not have a visible injury, right? So in other words, less visible disabilities face a higher risk of hold or rejection. Okay, so it wouldn't be enough, and in fact it isn't enough, as the qualitative analysis reveals when you go back and look at them, to just report that you have significant pain and suffering. And it's not, guys, when you think about this, it's not because the pension boards were ogres, right? They weren't trying to be mean to the disabled veterans. Think about the context, right? Think about the emphasis on somaticism, right? The emphasis on mechanical objectivity. These things had to have these correlates, right? They had to make sense in those frameworks. Maybe they were being mean as well, but it's not necessarily true, okay? But if you didn't have a visible disability, you faced a significantly higher risk of a hold or rejection. Now here's what I think is the single most startling statistic that I found in this study. Absolutely. 37% of the claims filed by amputees did not have physician testimony. 37%. That's actually quite a lot, okay? Most, I mean not most, but you know, over a third of them didn't have physician testimony. They had to have physician testimony, right? I mean, they had to have it. That's what the law actually says. Were most of them, what do you think, guys, based on what I said? Were most of them denied? They should have been denied. No, of course they weren't denied. Were most of them held? No, they weren't held either. Very, very few of the claims filed by amputees were held, okay? So here's another statistic, another way of sort of thinking about this. Of those who had a claim held, why would it be held? Right? There's all those reasons I put up there for why a claim would be held. Why would a claim be held? Well, so a claim could be held for all sorts of different reasons. What I do in this statistic is I categorize them as what I call pro forma reasons and substantive reasons. A pro forma reason really is a technical defect in your pension application. It's not a big substantive problem, right? It can be easily corrected. And in fact, many of them were easily corrected. So what's an example? The classic one is identity. Proof that you actually enrolled, that you actually enlisted in the Army. Now, why did this become important? Because as the war lengthened, right, I mean, Confederate records became completely haphazard. They really didn't know who had enlisted and who hadn't, okay? They didn't know who was on the muster roll. So this is a very common claim. They don't have an official record of you being in the Confederate Army. To correct this, very, very simple. All you need is testimony from any competent adult that you were in the Army. That's it. Not a big standard, okay? It could be someone who was standing next to you when you signed up. It could be your mom. It could be your wife. It doesn't make any difference. It could be the doctor from the town. Somebody who can say or is willing to swear, okay, that I know that this person enlisted in the Army. It could be one of your brothers, in your unit. They can say, yes, I served with this person. He or she was in the Army. He was in the Army, okay? So those are pro forma reasons. There are other pro forma reasons, okay? Time and place of death. That's a pretty easy one, right? For example, well, right? Or time and place of injury. Where and when were you injured? Name the battle. That's not that difficult, okay? So of those who had their claims held, okay, for those who had a visible injury, and you don't have to look at the odds ratio, you can look at the second one, they had 110% higher risk. Risk is a strange term here. It's a statistical term here. It's not a risk really, but they had 110% higher risk of having their claim held for a pro forma reason. To put that in plain English terms, what that means is if they had a visible injury, amputation, lost eye, open wounds, okay, necrotic bone, they were much more likely to be held for a pro forma reason, a technical defect in the pension claim that could be easily corrected. Okay? Of those claims held, if you had a claim held and you didn't have a visible injury, you were much more likely to have your claim held for a reason. Okay, for a substantive reason, for a claim that you would really need to do some work to bring about, okay? The most common one of those is proof of insufficient capacity to work. We don't really think you're incapable of working. We're not so sure, okay? You better prove to us that you're incapable of working. So let me give you an example. I don't know if you guys can see who this is. I'm not even sure I can read it. I can. It doesn't really matter, okay? This is a declaration of a soldier for pension of the state of North Carolina. The important part is what's going on at the bottom. Or more importantly, what is not going on at the bottom, because what is not going on at the bottom is physician testimony. Okay? You can see, you probably can't see, but up there at the top, this is actually an amputee. Okay? He's had an amputation. He describes the nature of his injury up there. Okay? There's the arrow. No physician testimony. What do we expect to happen? Well, we would predict based on law this should be rejected or at least held. If you guys can read that, that says approved. And if there was going to be a hold, that would be where it would be listed. There is no hold. This is not even held. Okay? Compare, okay, to another pension who was shot in the hip. That's what he says up there at the top. Okay? It says he was shot in the hip. Now down there at the bottom, you don't need to be able to read it, but you can see there's a lot of chicken scratch in there. Okay? There you have physician testimony. There you have the description of exactly what's going on. Okay? And there's a whole bunch of writing in there, okay? This is held for further proof of incapacity to work. That's probably the most substantive reason that you can find. We are not sure that you are truly as incapable of working as you think, okay? So how do you account for these things? And I think the ideas that I've been describing, somaticism, mechanical objectivity, there's really no way to fully account for what's going on in these pension claims without bringing these ideas in. Sometimes the aphorism, the way I refer to this, is that the truth of the body will out. Right? It's about being able to see the actual injury inscribed on the Confederate body. The Confederate body being the veteran's body in this case, right? When you see the amputation, when you see the lost eye, it's exactly what they said with regard to Marion W. Allison's claim, right? The injury is so palpable we do not require anything further. We don't even need what the law says we need, which is physician testimony. We don't need a physician to tell us that you're incapable of working, right? Which may or may not be true in any given case, right? But when we can't see the injury, when it isn't on the visible body, okay? We don't know, we don't have the natural object. We have this concern about truth. We don't have the lesion, or in the case of amputation, the absence of the lesion, which is what matters really most there, okay? So that's how this stuff all comes together. So let's say you're not buying it, because you might not be buying it. Okay? Let's go further. Do I have any further evidence that might convince you? Well, this one's pretty good. This is the actual standard for further proof. It's a form that's prepared by the state auditor. Okay, his name was William Roberts during 1885. And this was what would happen if your pension claim was held. You would get one of these letters from the state auditor. And it would say that, look, you've really got to do something further. Okay, and what is it further that you have to do down there at the bottom? By the way, all this stuff, guys, is available publicly for free from the North Carolina Office of Archives on their website. So you can go ahead and check all my math should you actually want to do any of this stuff, okay? Anybody can look at it. Down there at the bottom, it requires an examining physician to certify. So again, you've got physician certification coming by again, even if you've already had a physician testimony. Now the physician has to certify it again. Again, think about forensics, right? Think about the idea of ferreting out the truth, all those ideas coming together. The physician who's trained to correlate anatomy, with illness complaints. Down there at the bottom, what's the standard for proof? You have to have the physician certified that the injury that the pensioner has suffered is equivalent to the loss of an eye, an arm, or a leg. That's the standard for proof, okay? So the standard for proof are the visible, palpable injuries. If you actually want to prove that you are incapable of doing work, and work, by the way, because this is North Carolina, even by 1885, it's overwhelmingly heavy farm labor, okay? By 1885, they're starting to change a little bit, but still farm labor, naval industries as well, turpentine, pitch production, and things like that, but a lot of sort of heavy work, okay? So the standard for proof is the very criteria that I'm talking about, the visible, palpable injury. You have to have the physician certified that it's just as if you had lost an eye. It is just as if you had lost an arm, just as if you had lost an leg. That's what we can see. Okay, so a little bit about lost cause before I finish up. So this poor soul actually did lose a leg. This is one of the few amputees who actually, I'll tell you, well, I won't. This is one of the few amputees who had an unfavorable pension disposition. We'll say what happened to him in a minute. How did he lose his leg? Well, he was walking on a poorly constructed railroad bridge, and he fell through it. And he ended up losing his leg. So he's an amputee, right? Based on what I've said, the amputees, right, doesn't really matter, right? They don't have physician testimony. And look, he's actually got physician testimony there at the bottom. No, right? First, his claim was held. Then it was ultimately rejected. You can see there's that big line there that says disallowed. Okay? Why? Why? Because he doesn't fit in the lost cause mythos. Okay? He lost his leg by falling through a bridge. Okay? He did not take a mini ball wound or a artillery wound. He doesn't fit into the narrative. Right? The narrative of redemption, the narrative of pensions. That's the pension logic which animates the 1885 Act. He doesn't fit in, so he can't recover. So lost cause is something else that's going on as well. I mean, that's not something else I talk about. But again, to show the power of ideas on acts, the idea of the lost cause, the movement of the lost cause, determined that this poor soul was not eligible for a pension, even though he lost his leg, right? In the service of the Confederate Army. And there was no dispute about that. Nobody denied that. Okay? So all of this has something to do with malingering, okay? And I'll spend just a very brief time talking about malingering, okay? So malingering, now that is one of my favorite, and by favorite I mean least favorite terms, okay? It's my favorite because I think it's very interesting. It's my least favorite because I think it's a terrible term, okay? It's no accident that this is involved with concerns about malingering, all right? Malingering referring to feigned illness. You can actually still find malingering in the DSM, which I think is just fantastic from a historian standpoint. It's wonderful that it's still there, okay? And by wonderful, I mean terrible. But it's still there, and malingering, it has an old history, but it becomes, again, these social anxieties, things not being what they seem. It accelerates during the 19th century. And you can really trace this, and this is sort of the next phase of my project, is really getting into the history of malingering and actually trying to compare it with Britain and the US. I'm doing some comparative stuff as well. And so what do we find when we have malingering? It's a growing concern in the late 19th, early 20th century. Throughout the 19th century, it's always been there in military context. British, for example, commanders were always worried, all the way back, very, very early 19th century, early 1800s, worried about their soldiers faking it, feigning their illness, okay? But in the US in particular, malingering is a concern among slave owners. It's really chattel slavery. That's where you see concerns about malingering. It's because the slave owners were concerned that slaves would be feigning illness so that they didn't have to go work in the fields. Okay, and so this really applies mostly to black bodies during the 19th, during the early, sort of the antebellum period. What's particularly interesting is by the end of the 19th century, by the early 20th century, it has entered the white American vernacular. All of a sudden, white middle-class bodies, especially soldiers' bodies, become sites of concern, sites of anxiety in the Victorian sense. It's not a coincidence that you have major tracts on malingering coming out during the Civil War. Right? So 1863, you have Bartholomew, who's an important Union surgeon. He writes a tract on malingering and how to detect whether soldiers are actually malingering. The same year, you have South Carolinian J. Julian Chisholm, who writes a manual of surgery with a separate section devoted to being able to detect malingering. Chisholm actually said you should put patients under anesthetic and administer them a reflex test to see if their arm is actually moving so that we can tell whether or not their arm is actually paralyzed as they're claiming. Okay? So you see this sort of transmogrification from malingering being a concern that attended primarily black bodies and slaves in the antebellum South to one that moves on to white bodies, okay, afterwards. This is a contraption that they actually used to detect malingering in World War I. It's intimately connected to pensions. Intimately connected to pensions. growth of concerns about malingering, especially later decades in the 19th century, is absolutely a part of the growing pension scheme, right? We talked about Confederate pensions here, but the federal pension scheme was enormous, and its expenditures were just astronomical, okay, in those dollars. It was really huge, it was extensive, and people got extremely concerned about malingering, in addition to which the federal pension scheme began to be open to more and more and more people. So it started out relatively small, and then these people became eligible, and then 10 years later, these people became eligible, and it became part of the political process. And politicians in the late 19th century and the early 20th century very successfully ran on a program of expanding pensions. So everybody was getting in on the game, basically, right? And so the public is now getting increasingly concerned about feigned illness, increasing concerns of authenticity, truth, and doubt. And these things particularly attend invisible disabilities, right? When it's palpable, like we saw with Marion W. Allison, there's really not as much of a concern about it. I won't go into it, but in fact, the concerns about authenticity, truth, and doubt, and malingering, they reach a fever pitch in and around World War I. And they actually completely change the way that soldiers are cared for, the pension relief, and during World War I, particularly from the US, and they actually give birth to the rise of rehabilitation medicine. The field of rehabilitation medicine, as we know it today, was really born in World War I as a response to these concerns about malingering. And for those of you interested, I can direct you to some sources for that. So that's really, I think I'm going to stop there because I've yammered on enough. These are some of the conclusions. The idea that pain and disability could exist in the absence of these discrete visible lesions becomes increasingly untenable in the latter half of the 19th century. We see this arise of concerns over malingering. Early pension programs in North Carolina, they reflect the influence of somaticism and mechanical objectivity. And these amputee veterans, partly because of what we could see inscribed on their bodies, it really fuels the movement for pension schemes in the former Confederacy. So here are some references. I'm not going to leave those up, but these are some of the many, many people who owe many, many debts of thanks for me being able to do this. And so I think I'll just stop there and see if you guys have any questions. So thanks.
Yes, so when the government worker was looking at the application and there was a physician that signed the bottom part of the form that you showed us, basically they were kind of, if they disapproved it, they were basically rejecting what the physician said, right? Is that correct? I just wanted to get that, to understand that correctly. Okay, thank you.
Yes, that's absolutely right. I mean, if they were actually disallowed, they were disallowing what the physician actually said. Although there is one claim in particular which is fascinating, right? Because you can tell from the way the physician writes it that he's skeptical, right? That's pretty unusual. You don't see that very often, but you can see from the way that the physician wrote it that's actually skeptical. So it could get complicated. If the pension board, and there were two pension boards, there was the county pension board and the state pension board. The state pension board almost never overruled the county pension board. I could not find an instance where all the action is local, right? So you know, if they thought the physician was kind of dubious, then they might be more willing to sort of override the claim. But where the physician seems pretty clear on what's going on, they would be overriding the physician's certification, no doubt about it.
So in that, you showed one case, I believe, as a follow-up question where it came back and they also got another physician to sign it, or the same physician, I'm not sure, and they disapproved it. So twice they were rejected. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
That is correct.
I really like this. This was great. Question about the physicians, though. So some of the forms have the physician testimony on there. In that era, would there have been a cost to the individuals for going to physicians and having that sort of thing? Would that change some of the information if you had somebody who was injured, amputee or not amputee, that was rural and very poor? Doctors would still be scarce and all of that. Would that influence some of all of that?
Yeah, it had a huge influence, Jason. In fact, I mean, there's a couple things. I mean, one of the things I didn't talk about at all here is the influence of masculinity, the influence of ideas of Southern manhood here. I talk about it quite a bit in the manuscript. It's extremely important. It's actually part of the reason that most disabled Confederate veterans wouldn't go near applying for a pension, right? I mean, the ideas of sort of self-sufficient, rugged, and individual Southern man. I mean, this is palpable in 1885. It's not just, I mean, it's here today, but it wasn't like it was gone then, right? So you know, the idea of even going to seek a physician and a pension would be very difficult. You know, for people who wanted help, oftentimes they were in really bad shape. I mean, whether they were in bad shape physically, that usually had something to do with it, but you know, they couldn't do anything, right? I mean, they couldn't earn a living. I can't even imagine what that did to themselves and how they felt in a Southern context. And they didn't have money to pay for physicians, right? I mean, so that's a huge part of it. Yeah, and in fact, there are letters where the pensioner has actually written back to the pension board if they've had a claim held for proof of further, you know, for further evidence, you know, whatever it is, saying, you know, look, I just can't afford to pay to get a physician to come and look at what was going on. My guess is, with country doctors who had relationships with the men they were examining, they would probably do it for a pretty nominal fee, right? I mean, because again, that feeds into Southern shame and Southern redemption and the lost cause movement, and the idea of having a living monument or a living relic that you would sort of demand a payment for this kind of a service for the purpose of getting a pension, for goodness sake, right? Would probably have been difficult to swallow in a community where everybody knew everybody else, right? So there are plenty of cases where inability to pay is an issue, but I suspect in many cases it also was less of an issue.
What about people who were illiterate? Because you said that North Carolina had a very high rate of illiteracy. Did the person themselves have to fill it out, or could they have a neighbor, doctor, et cetera, fill it out?
It's an outstanding question. In the manuscript, I actually say that without graphological evidence, we really don't know who wrote these things. Right? I mean, we don't know whether what's on the pension form was actually written in the hand of the veteran themselves. There's no way to know, right? I mean, we really have no idea. In some cases, it's very clear that there are literacy issues. The title of the manuscript the title of this manuscript actually has a quote, which I love. It was from Marion W. Allison's pension claim. And it's a letter from a friend of his who Allison had enlisted, no pun intended, to help him adduce evidence of his domicile in North Carolina. Remember, he had that problem. He wasn't from North Carolina. So he wrote to a friend of his in Kentucky and say, please help me find some people who can testify that I've lived in North Carolina for umpteen years and I should get these benefits. And the letter that comes back is almost completely illiterate, except he asks for news. He says, please tell me how you are getting along in this sin-stained world, which I just think that is just a beautiful expression. And the letter is almost completely illiterate besides that, basically, right? So literacy is a huge problem. There's really no way to know. Some of them, like I said, there's plain evidence of literacy issues. Some of them there's not, but they might have had, I suspect some of them had physicians fill them out. There are actually some pension files where the physician actually said, I filled this out for them, right? And that really wasn't a bar to recovery. That didn't matter. As long as you presented before the clerk of the Superior Court, because it was about seeing, right? It was about authenticity. And you had to present your face to the clerk of the Superior Court with the affiant who was there with you, with the witness, right? So as long as you would do those things, it didn't really matter that it was written in somebody else's hand.
Now, how many clerks of Superior Court were there? If you live out in a very rural area, right, how long would it take you to get yourself and your witness to those? So would that also have caused problems?
That's a really good question. I mean, I don't know. I mean, most of these pension claims, so the Pension Act was actually enacted in March of 1885. The act actually said that nobody can start filing pension claims before May. So a lot of them start coming in the summer of 1885, but Marion W. Allison's was until 1887, right? And there's not unusual to find claims from years later. Too many years later, and then there were succeeding pension acts, and you could no longer recover under the Pension Act of 1885. So eventually, you couldn't do that. But my guess is yes, it was probably very difficult to do that. Most clerks of the Superior Courts were located near post offices, right? So even if you lived in a very rural area, if you could find your way to a post office, which by 1885 you could start to do, but 1866 you were in a much worse way if you were trying to do that in 1860. By 1885 you can start to get there. So I think my sense is that they probably faced challenges, transportation challenges, but I think probably some of the bigger challenges were actually like you say, getting a witness to come with you on that day, for example, getting the physician to certify those things. Those kinds of things were probably more difficult. If they were a widow, I think you probably had some additional challenges as well. You have to assemble sort of all this evidence before you could even begin to appear. So yeah, I think there were challenges, but it's hard to tell just from the claims themselves.
What was the composition of the pension board? I mean, was there a physician on the pension board?
Not as far as I can tell. So there's two different boards, right? There's the county pension board, and then there was the state pension board. The state pension board was the governor, it was the auditor. It was really Auditor Roberts, right? It was really an executive function. So it was the auditor. I don't know. We don't have any evidence. I can't find any evidence of the composition of this board. I cannot find any documentary evidence that the board even did anything, to be honest with you, right? That they
So we don't even know where they were veterans.
No idea. There's no evidence on the composition of the board. I think it's pretty likely that, as they would have referred to them in 1885, medical men sat on some of these boards. I think it's pretty hard to imagine that they wouldn't have been on there in some context. But unfortunately, there's no evidence that I could find as to what the actual composition of the board is. You might be able to find it in county records, but you'd have to go back through and do it piece by piece, and I don't want to do it.
Did you find evidence that women were injured in the war and able to accept pensions or claim pensions? I would be speaking about nurses or other women who served.
Now, this was about men, and I say that not in a this was gendered male, right? I mean, this was a program by men, well, by women, but because women had a huge part in actually getting the Pension Act out off the ground. But it was a program for the benefit of men, and it was gendered male. It was always the boys we have to care for, right? And so it's not that women couldn't have been there. Women are always there. You just have to look, right? Right? You have to know where to find them. So it's not the case that women weren't there, but I didn't find any evidence, right, of actual pensions or people claiming injuries on behalf of women. I didn't find it, which doesn't mean they aren't there. I'm sure they're there. I think the most striking material that you have from women is sometimes you'll have letters home. Sometimes you'll have letters that were written by veterans who would go on to die, actually, in the war. And you'll find exchanges of letters with women. Those can be quite powerful and heartbreaking, I think, as well, in many different ways. But actual women who served and were injured, I didn't find any evidence of it. And I think that I'm sure that was there. You wouldn't find it in the pension program. I guess that's what I was going to say. The logic of the pension program was gendered so strongly male, right? It was such about Southern manhood and caring for the Southern boys that women wouldn't show up in that context in that way. They would have to be sort of subaltern, I think is the expression, right? You'd have to look for them elsewhere. You'd have to find them in different places. I don't know if that answers your question, but okay.
That was fascinating.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.
When you're talking about all of this, and you're talking about the pensions, and particularly in terms of the limbs, I'm thinking, here is a state that was very rural. It's been devastated by all kinds of battles. You've got people with particularly legs, but maybe also arms, and if you want to grow crops, it's a time that's still very person-oriented. It's not very mechanical, and probably a lot of the livestock, etc., the horses or the oxen or whatever aren't there that were there in 1860. If you give people, the men, legs, you're going to have more food for both for themselves and for the market. That's what I was expecting to come up with as at least part of the rationale for this program.
There's no question it's part of the rationale, Melissa. So here's what's interesting about that. I mean, it's all about, pension logic is restorative. And you can see this, for example, in the preamble to the 1866 Act. They say this is why we're doing this, okay? And if you go through some of what Governor Worth has said, you can find it too. It's restorative. Well, what are we restoring? Well, we're restoring the veterans, amputee veterans. What are we restoring to them? It's answered in the preamble. We were restoring to them the ability to earn a living. That's what it actually says in the preamble. And of course, in 1866, the ability to earn a living for a man in North Carolina means farm labor. End of discussion. That's what it means, okay? Maybe a few other things, but that's overwhelmingly 95% of the time. That's what 90% of the time is what it means. So here's the interesting thing, right? Yes, that's clearly the logic behind it. But here's the dirty little secret, which is that they didn't work. And not only is that a dirty little secret, the problem is that wasn't a secret at all. This is where it starts to get very interesting, and I talk about this in the manuscript. Both the veterans who were getting them and the officials who championed the artificial limbs program knew They knew that even the state-of-the-art prosthetics that they got, and they didn't spare any expense, they did a really good job of getting state-of-the-art prosthetics. They knew that they did not work, okay, if the idea of work is to restore to somebody who has lost a leg the ability to perform heavy farm and field labor. They didn't work, okay? So why did they do it anyway? Okay, and that's a whole, actually that's part of this talk, but I don't want to keep you guys, okay? So, but it is very interesting, and there's no doubt, Melissa, that that's part of the logic that they were after, even while they knew that they couldn't do it, that what they were offering could not grant what the purpose of it was, right? So it has some kind of a different restorative function, I think, right? It has something to do with, again, the social and the cultural significance of the loss of the limb and the idea of giving someone a limb and restoring sort of the Confederate body. I think that has a lot to do with it.
Okay, I've got another question on that. What if, and this would have applied more to, in terms of widows getting pensions, person was severely injured in the war, but didn't die until later, but they died of their war injuries. I mean, because these pensions are not until 20 years later, after which a lot of people would have died. In some cases, their family probably died because they didn't have any way of making money. That's a big period of time. Yeah. If I were the widow of the person who died between those times, would I have been eligible for a pension?
No.
That's what I was afraid you were going to say.
This is one of the real sort of, oh boy, this is one of the oh boys that I found when I was doing this, right? I mean, and it was just because of the way that the system was set up. It's Kafkaesque is the only word I can use to describe it, but that's exactly what you'd find. If you were a widow, and if your husband had died of disease during the war, you could get a pension. If your husband contracted disease, there was one, and I talk about this in the manuscript, it's heartbreaking, gets pneumonia, right, and a bunch of other things, and then suffers, as far as I can tell, you know, Southern men didn't write much about pain and suffering, okay, but as far as you can see from the cold pension record, I mean, this guy is in a bad way. I mean, he actually has to have a limb amputated, okay, because of the infections and the sequelae from his disease. And then he eventually dies. He suffers for 20 years and then dies afterwards, and his claim is disallowed. You can't die after the war. You have to die during the war, according to the Pension Act of 1885. So that's exactly what this means. I mean, it's like I said, it's unbelievable. I mean, the widows of veterans who died of a terrible disease during the war could recover. The widows of veterans who had suffered for 20 years with a long-term and sometimes severe and really sort of, really sort of bad malady, only to die eventually after decades of suffering, could not recover under the Pension Act of 1885 because they died after the war. And that's actually what it says, right? Disallowed, right? Time and place of death.
Anyone else? Well, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.